Chapter 7, Scaling. Before I go into this chapter, I forgot the homework or the food for thought from last video on Chapter 6, Planning. So the key action there was to define your OKR, define the three most important objectives for yourself, and then challenge your team to define them and also guardrail them with key results, something that's measurable, that you can measure that whether something actually happened or not. All right, so that was for the last video. Chapter 7, Scaling. So far, if you followed the first 6 chapters and the introduction, you would have been really good at running your own team. One team, one product, hopefully, with maybe 5 to 10 people. But what happens when you want to start scaling to multiple projects, multiple teams, maybe multiple cities? How does that work, right? So there are multiple scaling models. Typically, it starts off as a centralized team. Eventually, it becomes a hybrid. And then if it's successful, it stays successful as a hybrid, but there may be a need for decentralization as well. So centralized, hybrid, decentralized. In a centralized model, you have the CEO. In this case, you could be the eng leader, and then you have all the leads reporting to you. And then there's one project team. In a decentralized, you might choose to have multiple project leads, and then they have their own project leads, and then they have reports as well. And this could be across city boundaries as well, across time zone boundaries, right? So how do you scale yourself to take on more projects, build revenue lines with multiple products, not just one product? That's the key theme that this chapter is going to introduce. So we will go over some of the questions in this chapter as to what are the things to think about when you have to start scaling. The next set of videos or the next chapters with what will describe some of the details. Here's just a set of questions, maybe thought-provoking questions for us to think, how does this work and what are the different models, right? So centralized, hybrid, and decentralized. So the three different, and so hybrid is not in the picture here, but it's a combination of centralized and decentralized, where you have a central eng leader with also some distribution, but not necessarily that each one of them are completely decentralized. There may be some centralized function and some decentralized function joined to a single eng leader. In the network topology, there's also distributed, where each of the nodes would be connected to other nodes, and then the decision making is truly distributed, right? In decentralized, again, there's a central CEO in some sense, or central leader, but again, the decision making is branched out to the leads in the team, and then they have their own decentralization model. Centralized, decentralized, and distributed network topology also gives us a parallel for team organization structure. So scaling starts with typically building a product, right? You build something, and then you have revenue that needs to be scaled, and that is a proxy of how many customers are there. So typically when you think of scaling, you think of scaling your number of customers, hopefully revenue per customers, and then for you to support both of them, an important aspect that's needed is employees, and then the organizational scaling, so that you can build things at a high execution rate with high quality to support more customers onboarding, and that in turn will get you higher revenue. So the key theme for the remaining chapters is, how do we scale the employee base? How do you scale your organization in a most effective way? And so a set of questions that come to mind are, if there is one team that you're really good at, right? The first 6 chapters gives you a really good thought process, how to set up the right metrics, how set up key objective, key results, have the right decision-making framework, doing meetings in the right way, etc. But what happens when you go from one team to multiple teams? What if those teams are not in the same city, or they're in multiple time zones for that matter, some in Pacific time zone, Eastern time zone, maybe Asian time zone, right? So how do you actually scale that kind of team? Is there a set of problems or questions that need to be answered? So there are. So let's go to some of those questions. So when you're building a product in a centralized fashion, you have known set of principles, you know the people, you know the best practices, you have built trust over time, and you know what is the rules of the game in terms of how engagement happens. How do you replicate that from one city or one team to the other team is an important area. And how do you make sure that what winning strategy worked for this product does continue to work for the second product, the third product, and so on and so forth, right? So going from one product line to multiple product lines is an important area as well. That's a very important question to ask as to, are you ready to scale up from one product to the second one? Same question Larry Page probably had, like when he invested in two different teams. One building Android with, I think, Andrew Rubin, and then Chrome is focused on browsers and laptops, but Android mainly focused on the phones, right? They're both operating systems in the sense, right? But they were two separate teams. They were decentralized in the sense that they had their own decision-making processes. They were not centralized. But at some point, you will realize that you'd want to centralize certain things, like let's say quality, or but you want to go to hybrid organization to scale it beyond certain points, right? So whether you keep your teams centralized or whether you decentralize them, that's an important question that will come. What functions would you want to centralize versus decentralize? And both of them has pros and cons. When you keep it centralized, there's a lot of focus. There's a mission at which you're going after. There's a set of key metrics, very few metrics that you're actually going to go after. You're going deep, right? Whereas in decentralization, there's bound to be a lot of parallelization, but a lot of rework. Potentially a lot of duplicate work happening, potentially not enough specialization being built. But then you could actually scale up with the decision making. You could build custom products and things like that, right? So there are pros and cons for being centralized versus decentralized. So how do you scale up? How do you go from, ideally you start centralized, and how do you go to decentralized or stay hybrid? That's an important decision that each of the leaders would face as they scale up. Same for Microsoft, I'm probably guessing, right? Like whether to buy versus build something like a office messaging system, right? Teams, right? So Slack was a competitor, right? And as you see, scaling up the different patterns here, Microsoft, based on this graph that I found out, has already overtaken Slack, even though started quite late in the game, right? So again, these are decisions as to whether should we build our own or should we buy, right? How should we scale up here as well, right? And then even as the size of the team, there's going to be differences. If you're scaling from 10 employees in Instagram to, let's say, 20 or 150, it's going to be different than scaling LinkedIn from, let's say, 150 employees to 1,000 employees, right? So there's going to be different levels of maturity that can have an impact on what kind of areas you focus on. Certain times you will never really focus on building tools, customer satisfaction, customer support, and a whole host of other areas. But at some point when it matures, that it becomes a top priority for you to start engaging and building those infrastructure and tools for stabilization and for scale. So it's very different. So you'd have to know what size of the team you have, what kind of leverage are you trying to build for, and that scaling would be very different. Prioritization would be very different on the size of the team. And as I said, different models could lead to duplication of work, especially if it's hybrid or decentralized. You would see repeated work, people working on the same set of problems, right? Let's say something's broken, maybe there are multiple teams working on it. So how do you make sure that there's leverage built when you try to decentralize or go to hybrid model? And then which departments to scale? You start off at a small company, you'd probably be building engineering and product, and then eventually you want to focus on sales and finance and HR and onboarding and marketing so that your products actually gets marketed, the revenue, marketing dollars are spent well. How do you build more products, right? So what is the level at which you start scaling? Which teams do you scale first? You can't probably scale all of those teams at the same time. If you do so, you'll probably scale none. So that focus on certain areas that are most important to scale is an important set of questions to ask as well. And finally, right, like how do you ensure good quality bar across, consistent quality bar across all the product lines, across engineering, across all the delivery channels that you build, right? How do you ensure control of that quality? That's something that we'll also look into the next set of videos, so that there is a high bar set throughout the products. Few articles that I think would be useful, especially for technology-enabled scaling. Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman. There's a Harvard Business Review article you could read in half an hour at max. And there's a really good book by him as well. Also on YouTube, there's like 20 videos where he's brought in, at Stanford, many industry leaders across various companies like Google, LinkedIn, Airbnb, and many more, who are sharing their experiences on scaling. So I'd highly, highly recommend watching that video after you're finished this video. So scaling, as I said, has many, many, many things to think about as you start scaling up. Quality becomes important. Who gets to scale first is important, whether you buy or build, whether you keep it centralized or decentralized, and so many other decisions that you would have to make. But that's an important problem. Once you're starting to scale, that means you're successful. You have got a product market fit. The customers really love this category of product that you're building, and the market size is big, so it's a great problem to have. So definitely go check out these 20 videos. I have seen most of them, not all of them, but yeah, I highly recommend it. All right, thank you. Happy scaling.